Please help me welcome Professor Jessica Flanigan.
Hi. Hi, I'm Jess. Thank you for coming. So today I'm going to talk about the right of self-medication, which is an old right, and I'm seeking to revive it because I think that it's been mistakenly forgotten in our language about rights. So just to show you an overview, I think that our existing system of pharmaceutical regulation violates these rights of self-medication. So prescription requirements, existing approval policies, so pre-market approval policies for new drugs, policies that stand between patients and access to pharmaceuticals violate their rights to make decisions about their own bodies. So the argument can be stated fairly simply. First of all, in general, it's wrong to disrespect a person's authority to make intimate and personal bodily decisions, and drug regulations do that. So those drug regulations are wrong. That's the argument. Let's get into more detail about it. So I begin with a premise that I imagine a lot of you share, which is the doctrine of informed consent. So in the past, medicine was much more unethical than it is today. I think we would agree. So before the 20th century, physicians were paternalistic towards patients on the regular, until a landmark case in 1913 where a patient, Mary Schlellendorf, went into New York Hospital and the physician said, oh, I think that you might have uterine fibroids. She was complaining of abdominal pain. Because it was the early 20th century, they said that they would have to do a vaginal exam under ether, so she was unconscious at the time. But before she went under anesthesia, she said, I will consent to an exam, but I will not consent to any kind of surgery or any kind of removal of any of my organs or anything like that. And then the doctors were like, cool. Of course, they examined her under ether, and they determined that a hysterectomy is medically warranted. They perform a hysterectomy without her consent. Obviously, she's upset by this, as you would be too, and she sues. It goes to the New York State Supreme Court. This is the beginning of the doctrine of informed consent, beginning with a prohibition on medical battery. And this was really the first time that the courts had gotten involved with people's medical choices to say, yeah, people have authority over their own bodies, even if they're acting against medical advice. And paternalistic interventions, such as these, even if they are justified on the basis of medical evidence, are nevertheless a violation of people's rights. The doctrine of informed consent emerged from this initial case, but it developed over the 20th century rather slowly via a series of cases that not only affirmed patients' rights to make decisions about their own bodies, prohibition on medical battery, but it also affirmed people's rights to have access to information about treatment alternatives, about the risks of not accepting treatment, and to make decisions without being deceived. Nevertheless, in 1968, 90% of oncologists reported that they routinely lied to their patients. This is fairly recent. Many of them even admitting that sometimes they would substitute in an alternative diagnosis to a terminal patient because they were afraid that the information of the terminal diagnosis would be so harmful to a patient that it would be unfair to the patient to give them that kind of diagnosis. This was fairly recently. This is like our parents' generation, where oncologists were lying to people about terminal cancer diagnoses. But now it would seem unconscionable to us. We would think, what a violation of people's authority to make their decisions. So what changed? What's the underlying principle that we now accept which justifies the doctrine of informed consent? Well, there's a lot of principles that justify informed consent. It's built on a pluralistic, broad framework. So for example, one reason that the doctrine of informed consent is now widely accepted is because even if in one-off cases, treating patients as if they don't have the authority to make medical decisions about their bodies would have good medical outcomes because people make bad decisions, on the whole, if the medical profession routinely lies to patients or tricks them about their diagnoses or commits medical battery by removing people's organs without their consent, that would have worse medical outcomes on balance, people think, because how many of you would go to a physician if you knew that there was some chance that the physician would just lie to you about your diagnosis or that the physician would perform surgery without authorization from you? So having a kind of presumption of trust between patients and their physicians has good medical outcomes, even if earning that trust by, in some cases, deferring to patients' risky treatment decisions and not doing the medically advisable treatment course will have worse medical outcomes. So even if one-off treatment decisions have worse medical outcomes because physicians are required to respect patients' authority, on balance, having a relationship of trust between patients and the medical professions will get people in front of doctors more, and it'll promote better medical outcomes. That's an empirical hypothesis. I think there's some evidence for it, but even if it weren't true, health is only one of many values. And so another value that you might care about is a non-health related value, like living in accordance with your religious principles, right? And physicians are experts about medicine, they're experts about health, but they're not experts about patients' lives as a whole. They're not experts about what makes a person's life go best on balance. Who's the expert about what makes a person's life go best on balance? Usually, in most cases, it's that person. Usually, each person has the best knowledge about how health factors into an overall scheme of values for them. And so even if physicians are medical authorities, they're not epistemic authorities about overall well-being. They don't know best about whether or not a Jehovah's Witness should get a blood transfusion or not, right? Because they just don't know how blood transfusions factor in to another value, a broader system of values that would say that blood transfusions are prohibited by their religion. You might be thinking though, well, wait a minute. Some people are clearly not the experts about what makes their lives go well on balance. Some people are terrible decision makers. We can all think of people in our lives that are like, I would dispute that premise, Flanigan, that people are the best judges about what makes their lives go well. Even in those cases, even when a person is making a decision that doesn't, on balance, promote their overall well-being, we have a strong presumption that each person has the normative authority to decide what happens to their own body, to make intimate and personal decisions for themselves, even if those decisions are going to be catastrophic for their well-being. So, for example, if a person decides to refuse chemotherapy, even though they have a treatable cancer, that could lead to a massive dead weight loss in well-being. The whole life that they could have lived could be lost for them. It could be the case that they competently judge refusing chemotherapy is the right thing for them to do, and that they're wrong. Because had they not refused chemotherapy, they would have lived a whole life worth living that would have, the benefits of which would have outweighed the harms associated with chemotherapy. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to force such a person to have chemotherapy, to undergo compulsory treatment on the grounds that they don't know what's best for them. So the first justification is, even if you just care about health outcomes, there's some reason theoretically to suspect that the doctrine of informed consent at an institutional level would promote good health outcomes. But why do we care about health? We care about health because it makes people's lives go better. People are the best judges of what is good for their lives. But even if people are not the best judges about what goes well for their lives, people also have very strong bodily rights to make what we might think of as objectively imprudent decisions about their health. Where the doctrine of informed consent applies, so too do rights of self-medication. So take the chemotherapy case. It would be wrong to force somebody to accept chemotherapy. It would also be wrong to stand in someone's way if they wanted chemotherapy. Setting aside issues of payment and access, it would be wrong to deprive people of access to a treatment that they desired. So imagine this kind of thought experiment about refusal on access. So if a person goes to the doctor and is like, yep, I know that I have been diagnosed with diabetes, and that you, the doctor, have recommended insulin therapy, but you know what? I don't feel like it's warranted for me to go to insulin just now. I'm going to try diet and exercise. The physician might say, no, you ought to be on insulin therapy. But the physician would not be warranted in prohibiting the person from trying diet and exercise first, right? The physician would not be able to say, oh, I'm going to force you to use insulin. Or the physician would not be permitted to trick the person into insulin therapy. Similarly, someone goes to the doctor and finds out they have diabetes, and the doctor's like, diet and exercise for you. And they're like, you know what? I know myself. It's just not going to happen. Let's just go straight to insulin therapy. Well, currently, under the current system, the doctor is legally empowered to stand between the patient and that treatment decision because insulin therapy requires a prescription. So why is it the case that the physician has to defer to the patient in the first case, but isn't required to defer to the patient in the second case? So my argument is that that asymmetry is unjustified, and that the physician should defer to the patient's decisions about their own bodies in both cases. So what would this mean? What would a right of self-medication mean, paralleling rights of informed consent? It would mean access to experimental therapies, prescription drugs, and prohibited drugs. So currently, the FDA requires pre-market testing before you can purchase a drug. So the drug has to go through clinical trials, first to determine that it's safe, and second to determine that it's effective before people can access those drugs. So that means that while the drug is being tested, people are prohibited from using it on the grounds that it could be unacceptably dangerous. Also, prescription requirements. So once a drug is approved, people need authorization from a physician to access the drug. Sometimes drugs are not approved. Some drugs are never even go through clinical trial. We've just decided, you know what, this drug, you're not going to be able to have it. So like, methamphetamines, like you just can't buy them. Like you can't get them by a prescription. You just can't get them. I mean, you can get them, but you can't legally get them. So you are legally prohibited from accessing drugs that haven't been approved, that aren't authorized by a physician, or that are legally prohibited. These types of policies violate rights of self-medication. They deprive people of making decisions about their own bodies that could be in their overall interests on the grounds that those types of decisions would be too medically risky. But the same considerations that justify the doctrine of informed consent also justify rights of self-medication. So the first justification for informed consent, which I think is probably the weakest because it's the most contingent, is that it would have good medical outcomes because people would have more trust in medicine, right? But similarly, did the claim that as an institution, violating informed consent would have poor medical outcomes, even if in one-off cases, patients might benefit from paternalistic interference by their doctors. So too, as an institution, the institution of drug prohibition has poor health effects. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the poor health effects and some of the evidence that prohibitive drug policies could have bad health effects. So say that you're just like, all I care about is medical outcomes. Even then, there's some reason to doubt the intuitive judgment that drug prohibitions are in the interest of the person's health. So first consider prohibitive approval policies. So pre-market testing requirements before a new drug can be sold. So there's two ways that these policies have bad health effects, but they're difficult to see. The first way that these policies have bad health effects is called drug loss. And that means that because the approval process currently takes 5 to 8 years, billions of dollars, it's very difficult to bring a new drug to market. Because it's so difficult to bring a new drug to market, it raises the barrier to innovation. So there's an economist, Frank Lichtenberg, that looks at the benefits of pharmaceutical innovation over the 20th century and says that it's one of the primary contributors to life expectancy. There's ample evidence that as you increase the cost of approval, it decreases the rate of innovation. And as you decrease the cost of approval, such as with the 92 Prescription Drug User Fee Acts or the Orphan Drug Acts, which encouraged people to invest in rare diseases, you increase innovation. And so there's a direct link between costly approval processes and less pharmaceutical innovation. And less pharmaceutical innovation, we have reason to believe, costs lives. It also costs money that could be devoted to other medical causes, because one of the cheapest ways to provide medical care is through drugs. Even though drugs are very expensive in the beginning, it still is the case that drugs are less expensive than a lengthy hospital stay. And so if you just are like, oh, I just care about medical outcomes and what's going to be in the interest of the broader health system, the fact that the current approval process is so expensive and it takes so long and that it discourages innovation means that who knows which treatments, which therapies, which cures could have been created had we not had this extraordinarily costly prohibitive approval process. And that has real bad health effects. We just can't see it because we can't even imagine the drugs that weren't invented because it was very expensive to create new drugs because of these barriers to innovation. The second kind of unseen cost that is still very real is drug lag. So this is a picture of Abigail Burroughs. She petitioned for access to an experimental therapy when she was about your age. She was 20, 21, and she was dying of head and neck cancer at the time. And her oncologist believed that an experimental therapy that was in clinical trials for colon cancer could treat her successfully. And she had medical experts on her side. She lobbied for access to the drug, but she was denied access because the trials were for colon cancer, not her kind of cancer. Abigail never got access to the drug. Her family sued for access. They were denied on appeal. And then she died of cancer. When she died, it looked like she died of cancer. But what she really died of was a lack of medication. So she died of a lack of effective treatment. And one thing that the approval process does is it prevents people from accessing potentially effective treatment. So say that a drug is approved by the FDA, hypothetical drug, and the FDA says, this hypothetical drug has been approved, and now that it's available to patients, it'll save 10,000 lives a year. Extraordinary. Say that it took, let's be generous, say that it took only 5 years to bring the drug to market, 10,000 lives per year. During that 5 years that the drug was being tested, people died waiting, right? 50,000 people could have been saved, but they were prohibited from accessing the drugs while it was being tested by the FDA. Now, I'm not saying that FDA regulations, are always all to the bad, right? But on balance, preventing people from accessing these drugs is preventing them from accessing potentially beneficial therapeutics on the grounds that, On the grounds that it might not be effective. But here's the real puzzle about that system. Currently, off-label prescribing is permissible. So you can access a drug legally via, with your doctor via prescription that hasn't been tested for efficacy. So once a drug is approved as safe and effective for one condition, patients can access it for any condition, which means that patients can access drugs currently off-label that have not been tested as effective for their condition or for their patient type. But most of the approval process is for efficacy testing. So most of that drug lag, which is ostensibly for the patient's benefit, is taken up conducting trials for effectiveness when being approved as an effective treatment is not even a necessary condition for accessing the drug once it's on the market. The pervasiveness of the off-label prescribing system indicates that the efficacy testing part is particularly unnecessary because many of the drugs that are prescribed off-label haven't been tested for efficacy. So prescription requirements, the evidence about health effects is, I think, weaker, but there is still some suggestive evidence that even prescription requirements might have bad health effects. So back in the 70s, this economist Sam Peltzman did this neat natural experiment about middle-income countries in Europe that enforced prescription requirements and some middle-income countries that didn't enforce prescription requirements. And he found that the countries that enforced the prescription requirements had higher rates of accidental poisonings of pharmaceuticals. Why would that have been the case? Well, he thinks that what happened was when drug use or pharmaceutical use was authorized by physicians, patients were much more risk accepting about using drugs. And so, think about when your doctor prescribes you a course of care versus if you were just it's all on your shoulders. You might think well, if the doctor said it was okay, then I suppose that it's safer. And then your tolerance for the risks associated with pharmaceutical use is higher, and that could lead to higher rates of accidental poisonings, or higher rates of pharmaceutical use more generally, which would then lead to higher rates of accidental poisonings. Even if that evidence, if you're skeptical, because that's just one study, there's also a bad health effect, which is just that the prescription drug requirements add costs onto accessing care. And so in order to access therapeutic drugs, if you have to get a prescription for them, there's a barrier to seeking treatment. And so Peter Temin's done some work which says that if you make it more costly to access drugs by putting them in prescription, people are less likely to use them. And then if they have things like cold medicines and they don't have access to treatment for colds, that could lead to more hospitalizations for pneumonia because people's colds develop because there's a higher cost to seeking treatment for cold therapy. And then when that happens, on balance, the fact that there were barriers to getting drug treatment could lead to worse health effects down the line. It's just suggestive evidence. So maybe you're skeptical, but the fact that the health effects of prohibition are not clear, the fact that it's not obvious that the prohibitive system right now is promoting patients' health, calls it into question, given that it does undermine patients' authority to make decisions that are seemingly in accordance with their interest of their lives as a whole, their judgments about their overall well-being. So this is Steve Hall. You can see the headline. So he received an experimental cancer vaccine in 2010. And it was risky. And it might have been the case that taking an experimental, untested cancer vaccine would have killed him quickly, would have caused an extraordinary amount of pain. But he judged that it made sense for him to enroll in a trial to access this totally untested experimental therapy because that was the only thing that would give him a chance of making it to his daughter's wedding. So he had a cancer diagnosis that gave him less than a 30% chance of surviving to his daughter's wedding. And he thought, you know what? It's worth it for me to try the uncertain path because the certain path seems horrible. And so he tried this uncertain drug. He made the judgment, given his life as a whole, that taking an untested experimental cancer vaccine as his therapeutic option was the right choice for him. Other patients might have disagreed. Other patients might have said, I can't tolerate that kind of uncertainty. It's not worth it for me. How would the FDA know whether or not it's in a person's interest to take the experimental cancer vaccine for a shot at your daughter's wedding? How does a regulatory agency know what's in a person's interest as a whole? Everybody's different. Everybody's lives are different. People encounter illnesses at different points in their lives. So when we think of the FDA or we think about pharmaceutical regulators as being experts, what is the expertise that they have? They're medical experts. They know about the properties of a drug. But is that what matters when it comes to the decision to use an experimental cancer vaccine? Steve Hall is the expert about his life. Whether or not a drug is acceptably risky isn't a property of a drug. It's not as if you can look under a microscope and be like, ah, yes, this experimental cancer vaccine, that's acceptably risky given the treatment, given what it's treating. No, that's a normative judgment. Whether or not risk is acceptable is about whether or not the risk of using a drug fits into the tapestry of a person's life in a way that makes it make sense for them to use it. But the pharmaceutical regulators, they can't tell if it's acceptably risky to use a drug or if a drug has unacceptable risks to a person's life. They don't know if somebody is holding out to see their daughter get a wedding or just trying to avoid pain. In medicine, there's a saying that says you should treat the patient, not the condition. But existing pharmaceutical regulations treat the condition, not the patient. Health is only one among many values. But pharmaceutical regulators, they can't tell which other values will weigh against the calculus of acceptable risk. If every patient is the expert about their overall well-being, that tells in favor of deferring to patients about treatment decisions, even if a drug is unapproved, even if it's an experimental vaccine like Steve Hall's. But the most powerful argument doesn't even hinge on whether or not these choices would promote overall well-being or not. Even if a drug choice isn't a person's medical or overall interest, it's still their choice to make. Consider, for example, cosmetic surgery. Cosmetic surgery is medically risky. Sometimes it's not even in a person's overall interest. It won't promote their well-being. It doesn't promote people's happiness like they think it will. It's expensive. There's the risks of anesthesia. Sometimes it goes really badly and it's just a risk that people take to get cosmetic surgery. But it's their bodies. When people say things like my body, my choice, so consider, abortion advocates, they're not just saying my body, my choice means no one can interfere with my decisions about my body. They're also saying that no one can interfere with my effective access to make voluntary agreements with other people that would facilitate me making decisions about my body. So when the government interferes with a person's ability to access treatment by interfering with providers, by interfering with pharmaceutical companies, by interfering with cosmetic surgeons, or by prohibiting abortion, for example, those types of prohibitions, even if they don't directly punish the patient or threaten the patient themselves with penalties, still limit a person's authority to make decisions about their own bodies. So why believe in self-medication? The same reasons we believe in informed consent, because people have extremely strong presumptive rights to make decisions about their bodies, because in some cases, people's rights to preserve their own lives require access to medication. Because it's disrespectful to express the judgment of patients that they're not qualified to make decisions about whether or not using a drug is going to be in their overall interest. And because in some cases, patients are in a very vulnerable place already. And if we're worried about patients being manipulated or lacking options, the last thing that you want to do is enforce coercive policies that limit their options further. So no one consents to the prescription drug requirements that prevent people from accessing pharmaceuticals without a prescription from a doctor. No one can consent to FDA regulations that prohibit patients from accessing untested experimental therapies. No one consents to the drug laws. These are policies that are imposed on patients which deprive them of the authority to make decisions about their bodies, which nobody can consent to. In general, it is morally worse to harm a person without their consent than to let something bad happen to them. Intuitively, this distinction between doing harm and allowing harm is used to justify the existing system of pharmaceutical regulation. The classic defense goes something like this. Well, look, if drug companies were allowed to sell untested therapies, if a prescription weren't required, then drug companies could kill people. They would harm people. They would actively harm patients in a way that they would be culpable for. But when the FDA or when public officials withhold access to drugs, well, it is true that some people will die because of the prohibitions, but they're just allowing harm to happen to them. That folk defense of regulation has it exactly backwards. Because when patients use experimental therapies, when patients use prescription drugs without authorization from a physician, for example, they consent to the risks associated with it. Because they would, as long as it's disclosed, like, hey, this is an experimental therapy, or as long as somebody discloses, look, I'm not going to get behind this choice as your physician. Okay, then the patient can consent, fully informed, to the risks associated with an untested drug or with a unauthorized drug, in the same way they can consent to use tested drugs or authorized drugs. When patients consent to the harms, that mitigates the wrongfulness of the harm. So even if people are harmed by using these types of drugs, the harm isn't as morally serious as a harm that they couldn't consent to. But as I'd said, patients don't consent to the harms associated with drug prohibition. Those do violate patients' bodily rights. And so drug companies don't culpably kill patients, even if patients use dangerous drugs and suffer or die as a result. But public officials do culpably kill patients because public officials violate patients' bodily rights in ways that they couldn't consent to. This isn't a new argument. It was put by Gideon Sofer. Gideon Sofer had Crohn's disease. And when he was in his 20s, he wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal saying that he wanted to access an experimental stem cell therapy for Crohn's disease, but he couldn't outside of the context of a clinical trial. And when he was in the context of the clinical trial, he got the standard of care. He didn't receive the new therapy. And he said, had not been for these regulations, I would have just directly accessed the experimental therapy because I knew that the standard of care didn't work for me. And so he himself said, the FDA is killing Crohn's patients. He put it in those types of terms because he thought, I have a bodily right as a patient with Crohn's to access the experimental stem cell therapy. I would consent to it. And the only thing standing in my way are these prohibitive approval processes for the therapy. Then subsequently, 3 years later, Gideon Sofer died of Crohn's disease. These are the victims that we don't see because it looks like what killed him was Crohn's disease. So when somebody dies because they consented to use a risky treatment, it looks like what killed them was the drug. But what actually killed them was their choice to take on a kind of risk, which they consented to. When somebody dies for lack of access, it looks like what killed them was the disease. But what actually kills them in some cases are prohibitive regulations that prevent patients from having a chance at saving their own lives. So if patients are informed and they can consent to the risks, I argue that they should be authorized to do so, and that regulations that stand in their way culpably harm them. We could think about this as an analogy to other types of human rights campaigns. So historically, civil rights violations, human rights violations, have been justified by offensive paternalistic arguments. So thinking back to previous civil rights struggles, paternalism was often used to disenfranchise vulnerable groups and to systematically violate their rights. So consider women and property rights. So should we give women property rights is a question that people had like a couple hundred years ago. And people were like, no, can't give women property rights because like, look, you give women a little bit of property and like, what do they spend it on? Like cupcakes or fabric or like something dumb, I don't know. They make terrible decisions. Why would it have looked that way? oh, because women didn't have property rights. And so like you would give women a little bit of property, they'd be like, I can't do anything with this property. And so they would spend it in ways that would look kind of irrational, but were just a reflection of the fact that the property system more generally was stacked against them having the ability to do anything productive with property. And then what was the justification for it then? Look, these women who we've deprived of property rights would make terrible decisions with property if they had it. But the seeming fact that they would make poor decisions with property rights, like, oh look, women, they're so reliant on men, who could give them property rights, was actually a symptom of the very oppression that was in question. I think something similar happens with drug laws, where people would say, look, patients, they don't know anything about their drug choices. People would make terrible decisions. People would be totally desperate. They wouldn't educate themselves about their choices. But perhaps that kind of seeming helplessness of patients to make informed treatment decisions is because they've been deprived the authority to make these treatment decisions. We heard the same thing with the informed consent. So physicians would say, oh yeah, you can't give patients a terminal cancer diagnosis. They would jump out the window. It was one survey of physicians who are lying to their patients. Knowing about a terminal diagnosis would do such harm to patients. Perhaps that could have been true, but that would just because society was set up in such a paternalistic way that people would have lacked the alternative resources to manage diagnoses. In fact, what happened when people were given a greater role in their medical decision making and people were informed of diagnoses was that patients reported higher levels of well-being because they knew what was happening with their bodies. In fact, what happened when women got property rights is that women now seemingly make less risky financial decisions than men in all of these contexts. And so, you can't look at the existing level of knowledge, the existing level of competency in decision making and say, well, these people, they don't seem very informed, they don't seem very capable of making good decisions, and so let's maintain the system that paternalistically maintain the system that deprives them of the authority to make these decisions. Give people the rights to make decisions about their own bodies, and then they will have an incentive to educate themselves about the risks and benefits of their treatment choices. So I think that it's morally praiseworthy in general to oppose paternalistic policies that systematically violate the rights of vulnerable groups. And I think that that applies to this case for patients, just as it applies in other civil rights contexts. So this picture here is a picture of the ACT UP protests, where AIDS patients were protesting outside the FDA for greater access to experimental therapies. And they explicitly, this was kind of the first explicit indication that rights of self-medication could be a political cause. And I really conceive of rights of self-medication as a political cause. So this is another ACT UP image. It's not just a clinical rights issue. It's not just a question for doctors for the clinical context. It's a question for policy. Because the existing system is one not only where physicians are empowered to stand between patients and their treatment decisions, but where public officials empower physicians to be the gatekeepers to care, and where public officials stand between patients and experimental therapies, or patients and prohibited drugs. And currently, I think we're seeing sort of the beginnings or the continuation of this movement, which began with the ACT UP protests, which is gaining steam in the 21st century. So I'm just going to describe to you some of the political movements in favor of rights of self-medication and kind of how rights of self-medication may develop as we go forward. So the first is patient-driven drug development. And so currently, patients are increasingly demanding a role in drug development. Nothing about us without us. Patients are forming online communities like Patients Like Me, and the online activism that they're doing and the research that they're independently doing about their illnesses and about their treatment options is driving the pace of drug development. One particularly striking example of this is patient-funded clinical trials, or efforts where patients can buy spots onto clinical trials. So patients are finding new ways, new models to access experimental therapies where before they had lacked them. In some cases, I think civil disobedience is warranted. And so there's a state representative in Georgia, Alan Peake, who would go to Colorado and bring medical marijuana back to patients in his state where medical marijuana was prohibited. So prohibitions of medical marijuana clearly violate rights of self-medication. You might call that being a drug dealer, but you might also call it civil disobedience in favor of people's rights of self-medication. And I think that the latter cast is the appropriate one, because these prohibitions against medical marijuana violate people's rights, and by facilitating greater access, you're resisting injustice in this way. And he's a public official doing this. More generally, patients have organized via these things called like right to try legislation. So via protest, via lobbying, via social media activism, right to try legislation is being enforced in increasing states. I say democracy here in quotes because it's like, you might think like, well, why not have like more grassroots movement? Why not try to convince voters? Here's a challenge about effectively changing laws in favor of rights of self-medication. Voters see the people who are killed by dangerous drugs like Vioxx. When Vioxx happens, voters think stronger FDA. When there's a drug disaster like elixir sulfitamide in the 1930s or thalidomide in the 1960s, there's a great public outcry for greater drug regulations because we have a kind of availability bias where we see the people who are actively harmed by these dangerous drugs. On the other hand, it's difficult for voters to see the victims of prohibitive regulations unless the victims themselves speak out. So I'm encouraged by these movements where the victims of the prohibitive regulations are, demonstrating the fact that they've been harmed by these regulations. But in order for voters to really get behind rights of self-medication, I hope to draw attention to the stories of the people who have been harmed by public officials' enforcement of these policies, because whenever people are harmed by dangerous drugs, even if they consented to the risks associated with it, it entrenches what I think is greater injustice or more unjust drug policy. So what's the upshot of this? Are drugs different? Here's the proposal that I would advocate for: certification. So we could have everything that the FDA does right now. So say that you're like, I love the FDA, it's my favorite regulatory agency. You're not alone. It's many people's favorite regulatory agency. They can do everything that they do right now. They can certify drugs as safe and effective. They can oversee clinical trials. They can expand the label to recertify drugs as effective as a drug's been on the market and more evidence comes in. The only thing that I'm saying the FDA shouldn't do is stand between patients and access to treatment. So imagine, that we had a certification system instead of an approval system. How much would change? So would you want to purchase uncertified, unlabeled, experimental, like rando, untested drugs? Probably you wouldn't. Probably you wouldn't be like, probably you care about your health and you wouldn't be like, sign me up for that. Although maybe some of you, now that I'm thinking about my audience, maybe some of you already do, right? So people already make a bunch of decisions to use sort of unlabeled, uncertified drugs that are grown like in somebody's basement or whatever. And like they make that risk-benefit calculus themselves. But probably not more than you already do. Probably you wouldn't go to Walgreens and be like, sign me up for some untested, unlabeled drugs when a certified drug was available to treat the condition you were trying to treat. So I don't think too much would change if we just shifted to certification and approval, unless the existing system is depriving patients of accessing therapies that could benefit them. And so, for example, take ketamine. Right now, people with treatment-resistant depression can't access ketamine, although there's some evidence that it could benefit them. Ketamine's pretty dangerous. Probably most of you wouldn't go buy some ketamine if you could. But imagine people currently who have serious treatment-resistant clinical depression. If they had access to ketamine, they might judge that the risks associated with using ketamine were worth it, given the place that they are in, given their lives as a whole and their overall values. They might take that risk. Any changes between the existing system and a certification system that happened would be evidence of the fact that the current system is preventing people from making decisions about their own bodies that they judge to be in their interests. So for most people, nothing needs to change. You can still go to your doctor, get advice from your doctor, but for people whose judgment departs from the judgment of experts, it would take the authority away from the medical experts and put it in the hands of the experts in a person's overall well-being. That is a big ask politically, right? That's the ideal, the certification versus approval system. What does the path to self-medication look like? Here are some intermediate proposals. The first is regulatory reciprocity. So currently, the regulatory agencies in each country need to approve every drug for those jurisdictions. An intermediate step would be, once a drug is approved in Europe, patients in America can access it. Reciprocity between agencies would at least speed patients' access to drugs, even if it wouldn't solve a lot of the problems entirely. Another proposal would just be having single regulatory standards for drugs and comparably dangerous products. So currently, we treat drugs as if they're special, as if they're different, and the risks that we accept for drugs are much lower than the risks of other activities. So, you can become a commercial fisherman. You can drink alcohol, which is dangerous. You can drive in a car. You can't do both at the same time, but you can do both of these separately dangerous things. We can make a lot of dangerous decisions. We don't have a good sense of our tolerance for risk collectively as a society and like how much paternalism we're willing to tolerate. All I'm saying with this kind of idea of like single regulatory standards is that there must be some principled reason for prohibiting people from making a choice for their own good. And that risk calculus doesn't change when it comes to drugs. And so whatever the level of risk people think that public officials can protect people from, they should apply it across the board. And I think that if we did apply that kind of standard of risk tolerance across the board, we would see that we wouldn't accept the heightened degree of paternalism and the overcaution that we have that characterizes the existing drug system in other areas of our life, in other areas of choice. Now, you might think but what about the insurance system? What if people make terrible decisions that impose costs on other people? Yeah, that's a real worry, I think, if you think that people have a right to health care. So say that you don't think people have a right to health care. It's just like a thing that some governments do to be beneficent towards their people. It's like, look, here's like a present for our people, health care, you're welcome. If that's the case, then there's no right to health care, then you don't get to violate somebody's rights because you want to subsequently give them a present, and it's going to make it more expensive for you to give them that present if they have the rights to make their own choices. So if there's no right to healthcare and it's just provided benevolently by public officials, I don't think that that would justify limiting people's rights. But what if people do have a right to healthcare, and then other people's risky decisions would make it more expensive to provide healthcare to people? It would impose social costs on the healthcare system. I also don't think that that's a persuasive argument in favor of paternalistic drug policies for the following reason. People don't make themselves preemptively liable to be interfered with on the grounds that subsequently protecting their rights will be expensive. So say that I'm a person who runs their mouth all the time and I say a bunch of inflammatory things on college campuses, which I don't. But just imagine that I did. And then protecting my physical safety, giving me police protection, would be more expensive because I'm exercising my freedom of speech in a way that makes protecting my other rights more expensive. That wouldn't be a justification for censorship. Freedom of speech would lack meaning if it was freedom of speech only for people for whom freedom of speech doesn't require any additional protection or support. So if people really do have bodily rights, if people really do have the authority to make risky medical decisions, risky decisions about their health, they don't forfeit their right to health care on the grounds that they're exercising their rights to make their treatment decisions more generally. And here's how we can see this is the case. We wouldn't think this about informed consent. We wouldn't think well, people have a right to health care, therefore, if you go to an NHS hospital, I guess they can take your organs out without your consent. You wouldn't think that people would preemptively forfeit their bodily rights in this other area of medicine on the grounds that they were being provided with public health insurance. So what does this imply? Rights of self-medication expand to other drugs that are used for non-therapeutic choices. So human enhancement, recreational drug use, and deadly drugs. So what I'm saying about people being the best judges about whether or not treatment is in their overall interest, that extends not just to therapeutics, but to other kinds of drugs as well. So drugs that have a decidedly non-therapeutic benefit, right? So recreational drugs or drugs that go beyond just treating a person, but enhance a person's cognitive abilities or strength, steroids, things like that. So this is Don and Iris Flounders. And this is a still from a YouTube video that was taken before they took drugs that ended their lives, Nembutal. In the video where they testify about their decision to end their lives, they're Australian. They describe a process where they had to go to Mexico to a veterinary pharmacy to access these drugs. Don, at the time, was suffering from mesothelioma. Iris wanted to end her life as well, mostly due to Don's illness and weariness associated with old age. So they flew to Mexico to access these drugs. Then they went back to Australia, and then the police raided their home to try to find the deadly drugs. And they didn't find them because, as Don said, luckily there's lots of rabbit burrows in Australia, I guess. That's where they had hidden them. And they said, during this horrible time, while Don's dying of mesothelioma, they very much resented having to fly halfway around the world to make this decision about how to end their lives in a way that they thought was compatible with their values as a couple. And they said in their video, we thought that we should have been permitted to get these drugs at our local pharmacy. So here again, deferring to the testimony of patients, they say, these policies that are put in place for our good, ostensibly, have harmed us a lot. They've exposed us to police raids. We should have had the authority to make this enormous, intimate, personal decision without interference from public officials. Does this mean there are no limits to what drugs people can use? Well, here's two limits that I do think we should consider. First, prescription requirements, perhaps for some antibiotics. So theoretically, in some cases, using drugs could harm other people. The justification for self-medication that I have sketched here is about your ability to consensually, voluntarily make decisions that could be harmful to yourself. But if your treatment decisions expose other people to an unwarranted risk of harm, if they're dangerous for other people because, for example, they increase the probability of the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, well then, in those cases, perhaps there could be prescription requirements for drugs. So antibiotics, yes, prescription requirements for access to antibiotics are in principle justifiable, despite my more general argument against prescription requirements. For children, the existing standard for treatment of children in other contexts is a best interest standard. So whether or not a child has access to any treatment is informed by the interest of the child. I don't think that that should change when it comes to access to experimental treatment. So I don't think that children should be prevented from using experimental therapies, because sometimes using experimental therapy is in the interest of the child. That said, I don't think that there should be a presumption that parents or small children themselves should be able to make that choice. I think that medical decisions for the child should be informed by the best interest of the child. But in some cases, that will mean that children do have access to experimental drugs. So this is Josh Hardy, and he and his family conducted a social media campaign to facilitate access to an experimental drug that would have treated an infection that he had that could have extended his life. They gained access. It did extend his life, plausibly. I mean, he subsequently died, but extended his life by, I think, probably about a year. And, in his case, it was in his interest to have access to an unapproved drug. But that doesn't mean that parents have the authority to make these types of treatment decisions for their children. So, every person has the authority to make decisions about their own bodies if they are informed, capable of making decisions, if they have capacity. Children don't have that kind of capacity, and so that is one limit to the right of self-medication. People who lack capacity, medical decisions should be made in their interest, but this still wouldn't justify the existing prohibitive system. It would just justify a different standard for children in accessing these drugs. So, thinking back to the beginning of this talk where we talked about informed consent, the doctrine of informed consent was the greatest ethical innovation in medicine in the 20th century. Think of the progress we've made. It's been incredible. For the 21st century, rights of self-medication are the next step.